She was seen as foolish just because she cared for a man who'd forgotten his name. What do you think you'll get from him, his will? One nurse laughed while another muttered, "If he's homeless, let him be." Still, Maggie sat beside him. Each afternoon, read poems aloud, walked him through the garden, and always called him Mr. Henry in a voice soft as wind. No one knew that the man they called the crazy old ghost was a missing billionaire who once ruled Wall Street, and he had chosen her to inherit his legacy. Maggie Evans at 25 never thought of herself as someone in need of a legacy. She wore a faded white blouse to work each day at Evergreen Manor, her braided hair often escaping its neat pattern by mid-afternoon. Yet every morning she stood at the corner of the nurse's station clutching a stack of patient charts, smiling softly at the hush that lingered in the corridors. Others teased her for her quiet ways, calling her the little saint or claiming she was more of a babysitter than a real medical professional. Sometimes they would catch her humming lullabies under her breath as she walked the halls, or whispering lines of poetry to those too far gone in their memories to respond. That very first day, Mr. Henry arrived when the ambulance had dropped him off with a single duffel bag. No family in sight, Maggie felt an instant empathy. He reminded her of her grandfather, who used to roam their backyard with half-finished thoughts on his lips, or of a kindly neighbor who forgot to pay bills until Maggie's mother gently sorted them out. So from the moment he was wheeled in, eyes lost, Maggie told herself, "This man may not remember us, but I will remember him." And so for all the sneers, all the casual cruelty that wove through the staff lounge when they spoke of the crazy old ghost, she remained unwavering. Each afternoon at 2, she'd finish her chart notes and slip out with a small volume of Robert Frost or Emily Dickinson, finding Mr. Henry in his usual spot by the garden bench, staring at something only he could see. She soon learned his daily habits, noticing how he walked in slow circuits near the rose bushes before settling on the wooden bench. He had a way of pressing his wrinkled hands into his lap as though struggling to recall the shape of a memory. Some days he'd murmur phrases, names, or words, but nothing coherent that indicated who he might be. The official records labeled him Henry Brooks, estimated to be around 80, with advanced memory loss. No next of kin listed, no prior address beyond a transient shelter. The nurse on duty when he arrived had scoffed. "Probably just another wanderer. We'll do our best, but these cases rarely improve." Maggie felt her heart twist at those words. Who was he truly? She believed no one was just another wanderer. She suspected there was a spark within him that needed only gentle care to reignite. Yet each time she tried to mention how Mr. Henry spoke with an oddly refined diction, muttering things like portfolio or charter or stock, her colleagues waved her off. They pointed to the battered cardigans he wore, or the absent look in his eyes, as evidence of a hopeless case. "Give it up," one aide told her, sipping coffee on a break. "You think you'll adopt him as your grandpa? Don't be naive." Maggie had quietly shrugged, for there was no sense arguing. Her father, a retired Army medic, had raised her to rely on calm conviction over heated debates. "If you know something is right, child," he used to say, "do it silently and steadily, no matter who laughs." At first, Maggie found satisfaction just sitting next to Mr. Henry under the budding lilac tree. She'd read short poems in her gentle voice, noticing a faint tremble pass over his brow when certain words were spoken. It was as if some part of him recognized the cadence, the idea of verse. Occasionally his gaze would sharpen and he'd turn to her as though on the verge of speaking. But then the clarity slipped away and he'd gaze back into the distance, lost once more. She tried not to hope for too much. Everyone told her it was wasted effort. A jaded nurse, Linda, once cornered Maggie near the nurse's station. "You're so busy reading your poems to a vegetable. Maybe focus on the living. Some of us have real work to do." Maggie swallowed the hurt and responded with a small nod, not trusting herself to speak. When she returned to Mr. Henry's side that afternoon, she brought chamomile tea she'd brewed in the break room and a new anthology of poems. She said nothing about Linda's words, but Henry's hand trembled as it folded around his cup, and she could almost imagine that he understood her need for quiet comfort in that moment. She realized she needed him as much as he needed her for reasons she couldn't fully articulate. Something about the hush that settled between them when she read, or the way he sometimes looked up at the sky as if searching for a memory in the clouds, gave her strength in a place that often felt bleak. Even so, Maggie was not immune to the culture that permeated Evergreen Manor. The administration prided itself on cost efficiency and routine compliance more than on genuine empathy. The head administrator, Ms. Palmer, was a brisk woman who typed endless documents in her small office and rarely left her desk to see the residents. She'd call Maggie in, occasionally flipping through a file with a slight frown. "Your daily logs, Ms." "Evans are thorough, but do you really need to spend so much time in non-essential activities with these patients? The hours must be accounted for, you know." Maggie would calmly explain that reading poetry was part of building a therapeutic environment. Ms. Palmer would sigh and remind her of deadlines, budgets, and the reality that lost causes do not attract funding. Maggie listened respectfully, each time remembering her mother's approach when at a school fundraiser, some snooty parents made snide remarks about the second-hand shoes on her feet. Her mother had simply held her head high, offered a gentle smile, and carried on, neither apologizing nor explaining. Maggie did the same. She offered her quiet courtesy and let Ms. Palmer's words roll past her. Then she'd step back into the hall, gather her charts, and continue her route. Still whispers circulated behind her back. Some staff teased that Maggie was hoping the old man would pass and leave her some hidden inheritance. Others said, if that old coot had a dime to his name, why isn't he in a fancy private facility? She never bothered to correct them. They were too fixed in their assumptions to see the genuine compassion that drove her. By the time spring gave way to the heat of early summer, Maggie had established a comforting ritual for Mr. Henry's days. After the lunch rush, which could be chaotic wheelchairs bumping into each other, short-tempered orderlies barking instructions, she'd guide him outside to the small garden path. There, under the shade of a blooming dogwood, she would read to him from whichever poet she had selected that day. He seemed particularly fond of Robert Frost, often blinking and murmuring faintly at certain lines. She'd ask if he wanted to walk further, but usually he preferred to settle in one spot, gazing at the garden's pale roses. She noticed how gentle his hands were, even in their trembling, the nails carefully trimmed, though not by the staff here, who rarely bothered with details beyond a quick clip. It was as if, in some forgotten past, he had known the importance of tidy appearances. At times, she would see a flash of that old life, in the way he cocked his head, listening for an echo of memory. She tried to piece together clues. Did he mention a place called Knightsbridge Tower, or was it Knightsbridge Lane? Once he said something about my driver, but never completed the thought. She kept a little notebook in her uniform pocket where she scribbled these fragments, hoping one day they might form a coherent picture. But the staff poked fun at her detective routine, so she learned to be discreet. Yet while Maggie guarded these small mysteries with compassion, the rest of Evergreen Manor seemed determined to beat them into the dust. Staff shortages led to more stress, more cynicism, and more corners cut. One day Maggie overheard a heated conversation in the corridor. "That old ghost is so out of it we could feed him cat food and he wouldn't notice." Another voice snickered. "He's practically a lost cause." "Why are we throwing resources at him?" Maggie confronted them quietly, explaining that every patient deserved dignity, but they rolled their eyes and walked away. The cruelty weighed on her heart. She confided in her father during one of their weekly phone calls. He was living in a small duplex several towns away, maintaining a modest garden. She told him about Mr. Henry and the staff's behavior. Her father sighed. "I was an army medic's sweetheart. I saw plenty of wounded men who looked hopeless, but I learned never to judge who can heal and who cannot just by how they look at the moment. Keep your course." That advice kept her going. On particularly harsh days, she'd duck into the staff restroom, stare at her own reflection under the fluorescent lights, and remind herself that she wasn't here for approval or applause. She was here to be the nurse she had always promised herself she would be. All the while, no one suspected that somewhere beneath Mr. Henry's confusion lay a lifetime of experiences that might rewrite everything they assumed. People dismissed him as a transient, a nobody. But Maggie noticed the faint English accent in his voice, the hint of refined speech patterns that lingered, even when he seemed lost in a haze. She watched his hands trace invisible outlines in the air as though he were accustomed to giving orders or outlining plans. Yet every clue remained intangible. She had once asked Ms. Palmer if they might search more thoroughly for his identity, or perhaps involve a genealogical service. Ms. Palmer scoffed at the idea. "You want to waste time and money on a man who could have been a drifter his whole life?" she asked with a dismissive shrug. "Focus on your paperwork. Let someone more practical handle the lost causes." For Maggie, it wasn't about the money or the records. It was about the possibility that Mr. Henry had a story worth uncovering, one that might bring him comfort. She let Ms. Palmer's words fade into the background, determined to do what she could in her spare time. By now, the routine scorn of her peers stung less. They saw her as a naive do-gooder, which in some ways she was proud to be. Whenever anyone teased her, she'd recall her mother standing at that fundraiser wearing those thrift store shoes, refusing to be ashamed. Maggie believed that a pure heart did not require apology or explanation. Then autumn arrived, painting the trees around Evergreen Manor in mild golds and rusted reds. The winding path in the garden became thick with fallen leaves, and Mr. Henry sometimes shuffled through them, scuffing his shoes in a slow, thoughtful way. Maggie fetched him a heavier cardigan on cooler days, though she noticed it had thinning elbows and drooping pockets. She meant to buy him a new one with her modest paycheck, but she hesitated, uncertain if that might be considered stepping over professional boundaries. She tried not to show her frustration at how little attention the facility gave to his comfort. She was also contending with an increased workload. New residents arrived, budgets tightened, and the staff's tension escalated. Linda and a few others seemed to take pleasure in flaunting their authority over Maggie, ordering her to handle the less pleasant tasks: bedpans, linen changes, medication runs. "You have time for poems, so you have time for this," Linda would say with a sneer. Maggie never complained. She juggled the tasks as best she could, still carving out those precious minutes to read a stanza or two to Mr. Henry each afternoon. She found that despite the cynicism around her, she found peace in the small rituals. The glint in Mr. Henry's eyes faint, though it was felt like a small victory against the tide of indifference. But the deeper into autumn they went, the more she sensed a growing hostility from certain staff members. They would toss remarks about how she was playing favorites, giving Mr. Henry special attention that others did not receive. In reality, she extended kindness to all her patients, but he was the only one who lacked family visits, the only one who seemed so utterly alone. She overheard some staff gossiping in the laundry room. "She's obviously hoping for a handout." "Why else waste so much time?" another voice said. "He can't even remember his name half the time. She's deluded." Maggie remained silent, yet inside she bristled. She had never asked Mr. Henry for anything. Truth be told, she took on extra shifts to help pay for her own living expenses, living in a simple studio apartment not far from the nursing home. She fantasized about a day when the staff might realize that human dignity was worth more than any potential payoff. But she did not speak of such hopes aloud. Instead, she made sure to bring a gently used sweater for Mr. Henry found at a thrift shop near her apartment on a particularly chilly day. He accepted it with a puzzled look, as if some distant courtesy made him say, "Thank you, dear," in a halting tone. That small flicker of gratitude was all she needed to keep going. One particularly windy afternoon, Maggie found Mr. Henry standing in the courtyard, gazing at the swirling leaves with an unreadable expression. She approached him, a new book of poems cradled under her arm. Before she could speak, he reached out and touched her hand with surprising intention. "My dear child," he said, voice trembling, "have we seen the stock reports?" The question startled her. She hesitated, unsure how to respond, then gently said, "No, Mr. Henry. We can look at the news if you like." He blinked, his eyes searching hers, and for a moment it seemed like he was balancing on the edge of a long-lost memory. Then just as quickly, confusion clouded his features, and he whispered, "Yes, the stock. The stock." She coaxed him inside, promising to read him something soothing. He mumbled references to market fluctuations and portfolios, words that were oddly specific for a man who had supposedly been homeless. Maggie felt a surge of curiosity. She had to find a moment to record these clues. Perhaps they were meaningless, or perhaps they pointed to a past life he no longer understood. She guided him back to his room, where she spent the next half hour reading him gentle verses until the lines of worry eased from his brow. Later that night, she scribbled those details in her little notebook. Mr. Henry mentioned stock reports, portfolio fluctuations, possibly a business background. But how to prove anything? Everyone believed he was a drifter. She resolved to keep her ears open, hoping for more. Winter descended with early darkness and chilly winds that rattled the windows of Evergreen Manor. The staff whirled about, complaining of holiday stress and the added burdens of covering shifts. Maggie felt the strain too, but she also found moments of quiet joy decorating Mr. Henry's windowsill with a small poinsettia, hoping the bright red leaves might spark some comfort. Other staff frowned upon her personal touches. Time spent outside the standard protocol was frowned upon. They saw it as inefficiency, especially Ms. Palmer, who pointed to the overworked schedule and reminded Maggie that emotional flourishes do not get the residents fed or bathed. Maggie bowed her head, but she did not stop placing small gestures of warmth wherever she could. She remembered how, as a child, she had once caught her mother crying alone in the kitchen because some volunteer committee had made her feel small. Her mother had dried her tears, then set out a vase of wildflowers on the windowsill, saying softly, "Even if they don't appreciate it, the flowers are a reminder to me. They show me we can be gentle no matter how harsh others can be." Maggie felt the same each time she brightened Mr. Henry's otherwise barren room with a small decoration or a fresh library book. One evening near midnight, a beeping alarm jolted Maggie awake in the cramped staff room. She had dozed off after a late shift. An emergency code had sounded. Mr. Henry's vitals were spiking. Rushing to his room, she found the on-call doctor adjusting his IV, diagnosing a sudden fever. The doctor cast Maggie a pointed glance, almost blaming her for not foreseeing this. She bit her lip, watching Mr. Henry's trembling form. He was drenched in sweat eyes, rolling under closed lids. The staff prepped him for a possible transfer to a local hospital if his condition worsened. She stayed by his bedside until dawn, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead, whispering lines of Robert Frost half in prayer. The same staff who usually mocked her were too busy or too tired to intervene. In the swirling confusion, no one made jokes about her devotion. They left her alone with him, which was how she wanted it. By morning, the fever began to break, but Mr. Henry remained in a delirious half-sleep. Maggie stepped out to get a fresh cloth. When she returned, she found him stirring. She braced herself for more incoherent ramblings. Instead, he opened his eyes and looked straight at her with startling clarity. "Where am I?" he rasped. She tried to respond gently, but before she could utter a word, he continued, "This is a nursing facility. Yes, I was missing." His voice quivered, yet carried an unmistakable authority. Maggie's heart hammered. She answered, "Yes, Mr. Henry, you're at Evergreen Manor in New Jersey." "You've been here a while." He pressed a hand to his temple, wincing, then said, "I need to speak with someone about my holdings." "Brooks Capital." Oh, I can't recall the full name, but it's mine or was mine. The breath caught in Maggie's throat. "Brooks Capital Holdings." She ventured, recalling the words from scattered bits of his speech. His eyes locked onto hers, the confusion waning. "Yes, that's it. Henry Brooks III? I lost track of my wife, my child. They died, didn't they? I wandered off." A tear slid down his cheek and Maggie's world tilted. The man they'd called a crazy old ghost was Henry Brooks III, a name that even someone as removed from financial circles as Maggie recognized. She recalled seeing it once or twice in business headlines years ago. Could it be the same man? He blinked, looking at her with an intensity that made her tremble. "Call Maggie Evans," he said, voice cracking. "She's the only one who reminded me I was still human." A startled laugh escaped her. "I'm Maggie Evans," she whispered. "I've been with you this whole time." His hand shook as he reached for hers. "Then, thank you," he managed. We need to get my estate in order." She stared, hardly able to process his words. In that moment, the staff nurse Linda walked in, eyes widening at the sight of Mr. Henry speaking lucidly. Maggie could almost sense the seismic shift that was about to rock Evergreen Manor. Within hours, the story spread like wildfire through the facility. The confused old man was, in fact, Henry Brooks III, the missing billionaire. No one believed it at first until they called in a specialist who confirmed his identity through records of certain scars, plus documents the man still had stashed somewhere that matched his name. The shock reverberated through the corridors. Nurses and aides who had sneered at him just days before now hovered near the door, hoping to be recognized. Ms. Palmer blanched, abruptly changing her tone whenever she passed Maggie, praising her compassionate approach. Reporters swarmed the gate once the news leaked. It turned out Henry Brooks III had vanished 3 years ago, overcome by grief after losing his wife and child in an accident. His firm had been in a legal limbo with partial direction by a board of trustees. Meanwhile, private detectives had searched for him, but he had slipped into transient life, eventually losing his memory. How he ended up at Evergreen Manor under an incomplete name remained murky, but now that he remembered, the details were emerging swiftly. The transformation in staff attitude was almost comical had it not been so hypocritical. People who had ignored or mocked Mr. Henry now lined up to offer assistance. The same ones who ridiculed Maggie as naive suddenly praised her. Linda cornered Maggie near the water cooler, stammering that she'd only been joking before, that no one really meant to be cruel. Another aide insisted she always suspected Henry might be someone special. Maggie listened quietly to these half-apologies, never betraying the swirl of conflicting emotions in her chest. She thought of the nights she'd spent coaxing Mr. Henry to sip water, reading him sonnets, ignoring the scorn around her. Now these same people wore false smiles. She felt oddly sad, not triumphant. She had never wanted wealth or notoriety, only to see this gentle man treated with decency. Things reached a crescendo a few days later when Henry asked to meet Ms. Palmer in his room. Maggie stood quietly in the corner at Henry's request. Ms. Palmer was all politeness, addressing him as Mr. Brooks, with a tremor of respect. He listened to her flustered explanations about how their facility had done its best for him. Then, in a measured voice, he told her he had awakened from a mental fog to find that only one person in the entire staff had treated him like a human being, Maggie Evans. He recounted how she read him poems, walked him in the garden, and never once ridiculed his confusion. Ms. Palmer swallowed darting glances at Maggie, clearly worried how Henry might react to discovering the reality of the staff's behavior. But Henry kept his tone calm, though his eyes hardened with quiet anger. "Do you have an explanation, Ms. Palmer?" he asked for. "Why so many on your staff seemed indifferent or downright hostile to a patient?" Ms. Palmer stuttered something about underfunding and stress, but Henry lifted a hand to stop her. "We'll discuss reparation for that later," he said. "In the meantime, I'll be inviting Ms. Evans to speak with me privately." Ms. Palmer nodded so vigorously that it seemed her neck might snap. After she slunk out, Henry turned to Maggie with a weary smile. "I owe you more than I can say," he murmured. "But let's start with me telling the world what you've done." At first, Maggie tried to dissuade him. She said she had only done her duty as a nurse, that she'd never expected any acknowledgement. But Henry insisted on bringing in an attorney who quickly verified the vast scope of his estate. "Your fortune is valued at over $2 billion, the attorney explained, pressing a sheaf of documents in front of Henry. "The board has been running the day-to-day operations, but they're legally bound to hand control back to you now that you've surfaced." Henry listened, his expression shifting between sadness and resolve. He spoke quietly of his late wife and child, explaining to Maggie that after their loss, he could not bear the emptiness of wealth. He had walked away, refusing to be found until his memory began to fail. "Some days I had no idea who I was," he said, voice trembling. "But you reminded me I mattered as a person, Maggie, not as an asset or a ghost." Tears sprang to Maggie's eyes. She bowed her head, uncertain how to handle such praise. The attorney nodded gravely, adding that the media frenzy was already building outside. They would want to know who had cared for Henry Brooks III all this time. Henry declared that Maggie should be recognized and that he intended to revise his will in her favor. Maggie felt her stomach lurch, both from gratitude and from a sense that she'd done nothing to earn such a colossal gift. "Please don't," she whispered, at first frightened by the enormity. But Henry's gaze was unwavering. "It's not a reward for you," he said softly. "It's my statement to the world that kindness is worth more than any market investment." In the days that followed, the national media pounced on the story. Cameras flashed as reporters tried to snag quotes from Maggie on her way in and out of Evergreen Manor. She dodged them as best she could, feeling overwhelmed by the attention. The staff seemed collectively astonished. The same people who once called Mr. Henry the crazy old ghost now stammered about how they had never truly meant any harm, how it was all an unfortunate misunderstanding. Ms. Palmer even issued a formal letter praising Maggie's tireless compassion and skill, though Maggie noticed it conveniently omitted any mention of the times Ms. Palmer told her to drop the lost causes. The residents, who were more coherent, also showed curiosity. Some had known Maggie as the sweet nurse who read them poems, but they never guessed she was on the verge of receiving a billionaire's gratitude. Over and over, Maggie insisted she wanted no fuss. She was content to keep doing her rounds, checking blood pressure, administering meds, talking softly to those who had no one else. But the world insisted on fuss. Soon Henry scheduled a press conference in a small common area of Evergreen Manor, with Ms. Palmer's reluctant permission. There was no denying him now that he held the purse strings for potential donations and improvements to the facility. Cameras and microphones assembled around the worn couches that usually served as a lounge for restless residents. Henry, frail but dignified in a borrowed suit, stood next to Maggie, who wore her simple blouse and braided hair. He announced that he was reclaiming his name, his estate, and his position in Brooks Capital Holdings, but not for personal grandeur. He would place the majority of his assets into a new trust that would help fund elderly care facilities across the nation, ensuring no one else fell through the cracks as he did. "And I will see to it," he added, voice resonating, "that the nurse who offered me her kindness, without expecting anything in return, will share in this trust. Maggie Evans has taught me that real wealth is measured in human warmth." Flashes from cameras erupted, and a wave of stunned gasps filled the room. Maggie stood there, her heart pounding, wishing she could hide behind the thick drapes. She had never wanted any of this. But Henry gently pressed her hand and murmured, "It's all right, dear. This isn't about you getting rich. It's about what you'll do with the chance to make a difference." She sensed the sincerity in his gaze and nodded, tears threatening to spill. In the aftermath, Ms. Palmer groveled at Maggie's feet, apologizing for her earlier coldness. Linda, the nurse who once made the cruelest jibes, tried to present herself as a longtime friend of both Maggie and Mr. Henry. The sudden transformation in people's attitudes might have amused Maggie if it didn't strike her as so transparently self-serving. She managed polite conversation, but in private she felt the weight of sadness that no one had recognized Mr. Henry's dignity until money came into play. She confided in Henry about that feeling one afternoon while helping him into a wheelchair for physical therapy. He patted her hand. "The world is easily dazzled by numbers," he said. "But you, Maggie, are not. That's why I trust you to honor what truly matters." His words fortified her. She decided that if an inheritance was coming, she would honor it in a way that benefited those like Mr. Henry, lost, alone, or forgotten. The official reading of Henry's revised will took place in a quiet conference room at a local law office, away from the media glare. Maggie accompanied him, feeling oddly out of place in a borrowed dress suit. The attorney enumerated Henry's assets, real estate portfolios, stock holdings, intellectual property rights, an overwhelming list that made Maggie's head spin. Henry clarified that most of it would go into the Brooks Evans Foundation, which he wanted Maggie to establish in partnership with him, focusing on elderly care and support for compassionate young caregivers. Henry explained that while Brooks Capital Holdings would continue under a board, the philanthropic arm would be personally overseen by Maggie, with him as an advisor for as long as his health permitted. Maggie realized she was stepping into an entirely new life. She swallowed her fear, recalling her father's advice: walk steadily in what you believe is right, no matter the storm around you. So she signed the documents, tears in her eyes. Henry's hand trembled a little, but his expression was calm. When it was done, she quietly thanked him. He shook his head. "I am the one who should thank you. You gave me back my soul." Inevitably, word reached the staff at Evergreen Manor that Maggie was now co-founder of a major philanthropic foundation. Some reacted with envy, some with awe, some with mortified guilt. Ms. Palmer gathered everyone for a staff meeting, publicly commending Maggie and offering an apology on behalf of anyone who may have overlooked the deeper humanity of our patients. Maggie stood at the edge of the room, not wanting to meet anyone's eyes. She accepted the apology with grace, but did not dwell on it. If her mother had taught her anything, it was that true dignity does not seek revenge or gloat in victory. It simply remains what it is, unaltered by the changing opinions of onlookers. Afterwards, Maggie retreated to Mr. Henry's side, helping him pack his few belongings. He would be moving into a specialized rehabilitation suite financed by his newly regained fortune. She felt torn about seeing him leave Evergreen Manor, though she knew it was for his best care. He smiled, reading her expression. "Don't fret, my dear," he said gently. "You and I will still see each other. We have a foundation to run after all." True to his word, Henry arranged for her to head the Brooks Evans Foundation, focusing on a pilot program within Evergreen Manor to improve care for memory loss patients, staff training, facility upgrades, additional nurses, resources they could scarcely imagine before. On her last official shift as a nurse, Maggie walked through the corridors with a bittersweet feeling. A few residents clung to her hand, thanking her for her gentle ways. Some staff members approached to ask if she could find them positions in the new program. She nodded politely, knowing that the foundation would hire based on kindness and competence, not nepotism. She ended the shift in the garden where she and Henry used to read poetry. She ran her fingers lightly over the bench they once shared, recalling his uncertain gaze and how it had softened whenever she read a line of verse. She smiled to think that his clarity, now shone brightly, restoring him to a man with a renewed sense of purpose despite the deep wounds of his past. Within weeks, the Brooks Evans Foundation was formally announced. Maggie was startled by how her life changed overnight. She found herself fielding calls from philanthropic boards, hospital networks, even occasional politicians who wanted to be associated with such a generous cause. Though terrified at times, she recalled her father's steady calm and her mother's unshakable dignity in the face of scorn. She reminded herself daily that this foundation was not a monument to her or Henry, but a living, breathing means to help others who felt alone and powerless. She worked tirelessly, meeting with elder care advocates, forging alliances. She remembered all the things that went wrong at Evergreen Manor: short staffing, managerial apathy, staff, negativity, and vowed that her foundation would model a different culture. Meanwhile, Henry recovered enough to attend some press events where he spoke candidly of how Maggie's unconditional kindness had restored his faith in humanity. He did not dwell on the details of his past suffering, but he did mention that after losing his family, he had wandered, rejecting a life he found hollow without love. When you've lost your heart, he told an interviewer, money becomes meaningless. I couldn't see a reason to hold on to it, or to myself. Then someone showed me that even the smallest act of caring can bring a man back from oblivion. As the months rolled by, Henry moved into a quiet estate outside the city, receiving advanced medical care to keep his age-related ailments at bay. Maggie visited him regularly, discussing foundation business and simply enjoying conversations that bridged their differences in age and background. He urged her to expand the foundation's reach to include not only elder care but also scholarships for young caregivers who showed promise and compassion. "We need more nurses like you," he said with conviction. Maggie smiled, thinking how uncertain she felt about the new responsibilities, but also how right it seemed. She tried to remain her usual self, wearing simple clothes, braiding her hair, reading poetry whenever she could steal a moment of calm. Henry teased her gently, saying, "You could buy a new wardrobe now. Surely the press would love to see you in designer outfits," but Maggie only shook her head. She recalled her mother's shoes thrift store finds that never diminished her grace. "I am who I've always been," she said softly. Henry nodded in understanding, proud of her unchanging heart. Over time, the changes at Evergreen Manor were palpable. The Brooks Evans Foundation channeled funds to hire more staff, train them in empathy-based caregiving, and upgrade old equipment. Even the once jaded Linda seemed softened by the improved atmosphere. Linda approached Maggie with genuine tears in her eyes, apologizing for her past cruelty. I was burnt out," she admitted. "I never thought someone like me could be part of something better." Maggie placed a hand on Linda's shoulder, recalling how she too had felt alone in that place. "All that matters is, we try now," she replied. Ms. Palmer retired early, replaced by a new administrator who valued humane treatment above budget lines. Residents reported feeling more listened to. The garden, once neglected, bloomed under the care of a new horticulture program. Maggie felt no triumph in these changes, only relief that Mr. Henry's trust had sparked a wave of renewal. Yet she also understood that money alone did not produce compassion. It merely provided the means for compassionate people to do more. She had always believed in kindness, but now she saw how resources could magnify that kindness 1,000-fold. Henry's health, though, remained fragile. He was nearly 80, and the ravages of time were not undone by the return of his memories. Some days he confided in Maggie that he felt exhausted, haunted by guilt, that he had not remained coherent enough to honor his wife and child's memory sooner. She would sit with him, holding his hand, reciting a poem he once seemed to recognize. On one such afternoon, he told her that if he had a second chance, he wanted to be a grandfather figure to those who had none. Maggie suggested they open a wing of the foundation dedicated to supporting orphaned children, offering them mentorship and safe spaces. Henry's eyes lit up at the idea. "Yes," he said. "Yes, that's how we'll bring my family's memory forward." In a matter of months, they set up a pilot program that connected orphaned or foster children with elderly volunteers who longed to feel needed. It was a small step, but Henry found a renewed spark in overseeing it. He would visit group homes even as his body grew weaker, encouraging the kids to believe in a future free from neglect. He insisted that love and belonging were the greatest forms of wealth. Maggie watched from the sidelines, her heart aching with bittersweet gratitude for how life had weaved their paths together. Gradually, reporters lost interest in the billionaire found in nursing home story. especially when no scandal followed, no legal suits or family feuds. The tabloids found no drama in Maggie's quiet acceptance of her inheritance, no infighting among heirs, no sensational betrayal. It was simply a story of kindness returned. Maggie was relieved to slip back into relative privacy, focusing on the foundation's day-to-day operations. She lived in a modest apartment, refusing to buy a mansion or adopt a lavish lifestyle. The greater portion of Henry's fortune was locked into philanthropic projects. Occasionally, her father would tease her on the phone. "So, my rich daughter, are you rolling in caviar yet?" She would laugh and remind him that she still ate homemade soup and wore her old blouses. He would express pride in how she'd stayed true to herself. A year after Henry's recovery, Maggie invited him to a special dedication ceremony at Evergreen Manor. They had renovated a large multi-purpose room, installing comfortable chairs, shelves of books, and bright artwork. Residents could gather there for reading clubs, music sessions, or just to chat. Maggie had arranged for a bronze plaque to be mounted on the wall, dedicating the room to Henry Brooks's late wife and child. The moment Henry arrived leaning on a cane, the entire staff, new and old, gave him a standing ovation. Maggie guided him to the plaque, where he slowly ran his fingers across the engraved names of his family members. Tears formed in his eyes, but there was a gentle peace in his expression. "They would be proud," he murmured. Maggie felt the room's hush, a collective recognition that this was more than a philanthropic gesture. It was a man reclaiming a sense of purpose. In the following months, Henry's involvement gradually lessened as his strength waned. He spent more time resting, surrounded by scrapbooks and occasional visits from business associates eager for his advice. Maggie oversaw the day-to-day foundation work, receiving updates from different care centers that adopted the Brooks-Evans model. She was heartened by stories of staff transformed by new training of elderly residents who found meaning in reading sessions of children who learned from these older mentors. Henry would smile when she reported these successes, though he seemed more tired with each passing day. "I've lived enough for 3 lifetimes," he once told her. "I just want to see that the seeds we planted keep growing." So she made him that promise, kneeling by his chair, holding his hand, vowing to keep the foundation alive no matter what. He looked at her with genuine affection, as if she were truly his granddaughter by spirit, if not by blood. One clear morning, Henry did not come to breakfast. A caregiver found him peacefully asleep, a half-smile on his lips, but no heartbeat in his chest. The quiet hush that fell over the estate was profound. Word soon reached Maggie, who felt her vision blur with tears. She rushed to his room, found him lying there as though simply dreaming. She pressed a trembling kiss to his forehead, whispering a stanza of Robert Frost, "Nothing gold can stay." The funeral was modest by Henry's request, with no pomp or flashy tributes. Just a handful of close associates, foundation staff, and the children he had mentored. Maggie read a poem in his memory, voice cracking at times, but determined to finish. Afterwards, she stood at the graveside, reflecting that Henry had found in her a simple kindness that awakened him from a dark night of grief. In turn, he had entrusted her with a mission that outlived him. That evening, Maggie sat alone in her small apartment, the final will and foundation paperwork spread across her table. Henry had indeed left her in charge, awarding her the majority of the controlling stake in the foundation's finances. She stared at the papers for a long time, remembering the girl she was, a nurse in a faded blouse, reading poems to a forgotten man. She wondered what her mother would say now, seeing her name on official documents worth more money than she could ever imagine. She felt no surge of greed or power, only a solemn responsibility. Then, as was her habit, she brewed herself a cup of chamomile tea, closed her eyes and murmured a quiet vow to remain who she was, soft-spoken, unwavering, caring no matter how large the numbers in the bank accounts. By the time the next spring arrived, the Brooks-Evans Foundation had blossomed in ways Maggie scarcely anticipated. They launched a grandfather's program connecting elders without families to orphaned children. They funded expansions in multiple nursing homes, encouraging staff to adopt the empathy-based approach Maggie once championed in secret. Across the state and soon beyond, philanthropic circles took note that a once-lost billionaire had ignited a wave of compassion that thrived under the direction of a nurse too humble to appear at gala receptions. Maggie avoided the spotlight, preferring to visit the beneficiaries, quietly talk with nurses, and sit with lonely patients, just as she once did with Henry. She still wore her braided hair, her second-hand shoes, and carried poetry books to read to anyone who would listen. The press occasionally tried to catch her for interviews, but she politely demurred, saying that the work mattered more than the headlines. Yet the staff at various facilities recognized her and told her stories with gratitude. "Because of your foundation, we've hired more caring aides," or "We built a therapy garden and you should see how the residents light up." Each time Maggie felt a pang of joy, certain that Henry, watching from wherever his soul now rested, would be proud. She also continued her relationship with her father, who teased her gently about being New Jersey's quiet philanthropist. He visited her office once, seeing the swirl of papers and proposals, and said, "It's good you never let them break your spirit, sweetheart. You did right by that old man." She nodded, tears in her eyes, recalling how she once was belittled for reading poems to Henry, for calling him Mr. Henry and a voice soft as wind. Now that voice had ushered in a transformation no cynic would have believed. She did not regret a single day spent ignoring the taunts. She had learned from her mother's quiet resilience that dignity is not about acceptance from the crowd, but about fidelity to one's own kindness. Meanwhile, Evergreen Manor thrived under new leadership and generous grants from the foundation. The oppressive atmosphere dissolved, replaced by an unspoken camaraderie. At times, Maggie visited incognito to chat with residents now that she was no longer on staff. Some recognized her anyway, offering thanks for how the place felt more like a home than a warehouse. She recalled the days she walked Mr. Henry along the rose bushes, how she'd read him lines about stopping by woods on a snowy evening. Her voice had broken once or twice, but she pressed on, telling him that even a mind lost in confusion deserved the beauty of poetry. A twinge of sadness always accompanied those memories, for she missed him dearly. Yet she also felt the warmth of having granted him solace in his final years. It was nearly 2 years after Henry's passing that Maggie decided to hold a small commemoration in the garden of Evergreen Manor, unveiling a statue of Henry Brooks III. Nothing grand, just a life-size bronze figure seated on a bench with a gentle expression reminiscent of how he'd appear at dusk, gazing at the horizon. She invited staff residents, some donors, and the children from the grandfather's program. On a mild spring day, they gathered among blooming flowers. Maggie stood wearing her usual modest attire and spoke softly about the man who had once roamed this very place, forgotten by the world. She recounted how his memory returned and how his generosity grew from a heart reacquainted with love, not from a thirst for recognition. Tears glistened in the eyes of many present. The bronze figure captured Henry's gentle spirit, and in that moment, Maggie felt as if he were among them, smiling in quiet approval. No one sneered at her now. No one called her naive or foolish. The world had shifted around her truth. If this story touched something in you, like it. Share it. Leave a comment below, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more stories where quiet hearts change the world without asking for anything in return.